They didn't come from a studio. They came from a survival instinct. If you stood on a cracked sidewalk in Southside Houston in the late 1980 seconds, you'd see three kids, Dino, Shazam, and G.E., who looked like they were waiting for a bus that was never going to come. They weren't just singing, they were trying to vibrate their way out of a zip code that the city of Houston had effectively deleted from the map. The investigation into the origins of HTown begins with Dino Conner. He was the heartbeat, the lead, the man with a voice that felt like it had been dragged through gravel and then soaked in silk. His mother said he sang before he could read, but in the South Side, talent is cheap. Everyone can sing. The difference with Dino was the desperation. His brother, Shazam, provided the grounding shadows of the harmony, while Daryl G. Wes. Jackson turned every street corner into a makeshift stage. In 1987, they called themselves the Gents. It was a desperate attempt at dignity. They were 14 years old when they recorded their first album, It's Not a Dream, but the industry quickly turned it into a nightmare. In the world of music forensics, we call this the Great Flop. The album didn't just fail, it vanished. Legend has it that hundreds of those cassettes ended up sitting in the humid trunk of a beat-up sedan, the plastic warping under the Texas sun until the music literally melted into silence. They were children who had given their only shot to a world that didn't even bother to say no, it just ignored them. Enter Bishop Stick Burrell. To the casual observer, Stick was the mentor, the man who had toured with the blues master Marvin Cease. But as we dig into the dossier, we see a more complex figure. Stick didn't just see talent, he saw a commodity. He took these boys into a humid, makeshift studio and began stripping away their gents persona. He wanted something raw, something that smelled like the streets they were trying to flee. Stick pulled a sample from Zapp and Rogers' Be All Right, a warm, hypnotic loop that felt like a heartbeat. He gave the boys the beat and a directive. Stop singing for the church. Sing for the bedroom. There was a tension in those early sessions. Stick was pushing Dino to lean into a predatory, sensual energy that the boys hadn't yet mastered. It was the birth of Knockin Da Boots, a track recorded in a room so small the air ran out before the song ended. They were still wearing torn sneakers and eating fast food bought with change found in couch cushions. They had no idea that a local manager was about to hijack the fate of a rap mogul named Luke Skywalker just to get them heard. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, thinking they were about to fly. They didn't realize that in the music business, sometimes the only difference between a star and a sacrifice is the fine print in the contract. By early 1993, the track Knockin Da Boots was a piece of lightning trapped in a cheap glass bottle sitting on a dusty desk in a Houston back office. But in this industry, lightning needs a conductor who isn't afraid to get burned. The investigation into HTown's big break reveals a masterclass in street-level manipulation. Their manager, Pat Johnson, knew he held a diamond in the rough, but he needed a jeweler with enough weight to crush the gatekeepers of the national charts. That jeweler was Luther, Uncle Luke Campbell, the notorious founder of 2 Live Crew, a man who had turned the Miami bass sound into a multi-million-dollar empire of controversy. The dossier on their first meeting reads like a choreographed heist. Johnson reportedly engineered a missed flight for Luke Skywalker while he was in Houston, effectively trapping the mogul in the city. He then dragged a reluctant, exhausted Luke into a cramped, airless studio to hear 3 kids he'd never heard of. Luke walked in expecting amateur hour. He walked out having found the future of Southern R&B. He saw Dino thin, wearing clothes that had been washed so many times they were translucent, but possessing a vocal gravity that made the studio monitors rattle. Luke made an offer on the spot, but it was a predatory rescue. The first thing he did was strip them of their name, the Gents. He rebranded them HTown. It was a brilliant branding move, anchoring them to the raw, rugged energy of Houston streets, but it was also the first psychological tether. In this new partnership, the artists were the passengers, and Luke was the driver with his foot floored on the accelerator. When Knockin Da Boots dropped in March 1993, it didn't just climb the charts, it colonized them with a speed that terrified the industry establishment. It hit HTown on the Billboard R&B charts and remained a permanent fixture for weeks, eventually crossing over to hit #3 on the Hot 100. Every car radio from the projects of Detroit to the suburbs of Atlanta became a confession booth for Dino's raw, unapologetic delivery. The investigation into the song's sonic DNA shows it wasn't just another slow jam. It was the arrival of a new, aggressive, Southern soul, less polished than the New York New Jack Swing and more dangerous than the smooth Philly ballads. It was the sound of the South Side finally kicking the door down and demanding a seat at the head of the table. The debut album, Fever for the Flavor, followed, and the media frenzy was absolute. HTown was suddenly thrust onto the Coca-Cola Summerfest tour, sharing stages with heavyweight acts like SWV and Naughty by Nature. They were performing in 20,000-capacity arenas, surrounded by screaming fans and blinding flashes. But here is the forensic anomaly discovered in the financial trail. While the album was moving millions of units, and the group was standing on stage winning Soul Train awards for Best New Artist, their private bank accounts remained flatlined. The investigation into the financial records of Luke Records during this era is a descent into the dark heart of the 90 Seconds music machine. Despite being the hottest group in the country, with Knockin Da Boots becoming a cultural catchphrase, the three members of HTown reportedly received a combined total of only $36,000 for their initial global success. After the labels, the managers, and the recoupable expenses were paid, these three stars were left with $12,000 each. There were no mansions. There were no fleets of luxury cars. There were only hotel per diems and stage shirts that Dino eventually had to sell to fans after shows for $100 apiece just to ensure the group could afford a decent meal. While they looked like icons on Video Soul, they were living like migrant laborers in silk suits. The investigation reveals that this was the exact moment the shackles first started to itch. Dino, being the visionary of the group, began to realize that the industry didn't actually want his soul or his message. They wanted his boots. They wanted the sex, the sweat, and the marketable imagery of the Southern thug lover. But as we move into part 3, we will see how Kevin Dino Conner decided that he would rather be a free man in a storm than a slave in a platinum cage, a decision that would turn his own record label into his deadliest enemy. By 1994, the fever that had propelled HTown to the top of the world had broken, leaving behind a cold, clinical, and devastating reality. On paper, Dino, Shazam, and G, what I priests, were the kings of R&B. They were the faces on the posters and the voices in the headphones of millions. But in the fluorescent light of their dressing rooms, they saw three men who were being effectively harvested for their labor. The investigation into the group's psychological state during the recording of their second album, Beggin' After Dark, reveals a deep, structural fracture between the artists and the machine. Dino Conner was no longer content with being the Southern Prince of slow jams. He was starting to see the invisible wires that moved his limbs every time he stepped onto a stage to perform a song he no longer believed in. The primary conflict was a war over creative autonomy. Luther Campbell and Luke Records wanted a carbon copy sequel to the first album. They demanded more sex, more boots, and more marketable lust. They viewed HTown as a high-yield commodity with a specific shelf life. But Dino was undergoing a profound spiritual and intellectual shift. He was becoming a man who wanted to sing about the complexity of love, the weight of God, and the inherent dignity of the women who were keeping the group's lights on. The investigation shows that the label's response was a cold, corporate no. To them, HTown was not a group of growing men. They were a formula that had been solved and was now being exploited for maximum extraction. This simmering tension culminated in one of the most shocking and controversial moments in the history of televised R&B. When HTown was invited onto the iconic show Video Soul with the legendary Donnie Simpson, the industry expected three grateful stars in silk suits. Instead, Dino, Shazam, and G. I walked onto that set wearing heavy, rusted iron shackles on their wrists and ankles. They sat on that couch, the metal clinking with every movement, and turned a standard promotional interview into a televised rebellion. The investigation into this shackle protest shows it was a calculated forensic strike against the entire music industry infrastructure. On live television, Dino stood before millions and declared that they were slaves to the industry. It wasn't just a theatrical stunt, it was a public exposure of their predatory contract. They were showing the world that even though their voices were being broadcast to every corner of the globe, their physical bodies and their intellectual property were owned by a master. The fallout was immediate and lethal to their career momentum. Luke Records was humiliated on a national stage, and the industry's powers that be began to circulate the label for Dino, difficult. In the music business, difficult is the word used to devalue an artist who knows his worth and refuses to be silent about his exploitation. Despite the internal war and the lack of traditional label support, their second album, Beggin' After Dark, dropped and managed to go gold, fueled by the hauntingly beautiful single Emotions. This track was the forensic proof that Dino's intuition was correct. The audience was hungry for vulnerability and depth. However, the investigation reveals that as the group's artistic integrity grew, their commercial infrastructure was being quietly but systematically sabotaged. Promotion budgets were reallocated. Radio tours were canceled last minute, and the machine began the process of starving the group out, denying them the oxygen of publicity until they either surrendered or disappeared. In the midst of this sabotage, a lifeline appeared from an unexpected source. Comedian Martin Lawrence, a man who respected the group's raw Southern honesty, hand-picked HTown to record the theme for his film A Thin Line Between Love and Hate. They teamed up with Shirley Murdoch and the legendary talkbox pioneer Roger Troutman to create a masterpiece of Southern soul that transcended the drama of their label. It was a top 40 hit, a bridge back to mainstream relevance. But while the song was soaring, the house of Luke Records was finally collapsing under a mountain of lawsuits, injunctions, and total financial mismanagement. By 1996, HTown finally fought their way to freedom, but it was a scorched earth victory. They managed to leave the label, but in the settlement, they left behind their accumulated royalties, their master recordings, and their massive commercial momentum. They were free men, but they were starting from zero in an industry that had already marked them as troublemakers. Dino looked at his brothers in the quiet of a Houston night and made a vow. The next album wouldn't be for the charts, it wouldn't be for the label, and it wouldn't be for the formula. It would be for the soul. He was preparing to record Ladies Edition, a project that would define his legacy as a preacher of passion. He was choosing a path of conscience in a world that only valued performance. As we move into part 4, we see the highest peak of Dino's character and the beginning of the road that would lead him back to a fatal, silent intersection in the city that raised him. By 1997, HTown had achieved what most industry insiders considered a legal impossibility. They had survived the radioactive wreckage of Luke Records. They had navigated the legal minefields, bypassed the injunctions, and signed a new, high-stakes deal with Relativity Records, a contract that handed them $1 million each. For Shazam and G.I., this was the Great Reset. They saw it as a chance to reclaim their throne at the summit of the R&B charts, to return to the life of luxury and platinum plaques. But for Kevin Dino Conner, the money wasn't the reward, it was the fuel for a mission. The investigation into his journals, personal letters, and private conversations during this period reveals a man who was no longer interested in being the world's sex symbol. Dino Conner was looking for something much rarer in the music business: redemption. He was profoundly haunted by the toxic culture of the 1,990 seconds, the rising tide of domestic violence, the increasing hypersexualization of black women in music videos, and the hollow, often predatory nature of the bedroom R&B genre he had helped popularize. Dino decided to turn HTown's third album into a cultural manifesto. He titled it Ladies Edition, Woman's World. This wasn't just a collection of 11 songs. It was a forensic attempt to heal the fractured relationship between black men and women. Dino was moving from the boot knocker to the protector. Dino took the radical step of dedicating the entire project to the memory of Nicole Brown Simpson. On the back of the CD case, in the space usually reserved for logos and copyright fine print, He did something unprecedented for a platinum R&B group. He printed a national helpline for abused women. The investigation into the album's lyrical content shows a total, uncompromising abandonment of the Southern thug persona. Instead of moans, bed-spring rhythms, and overt lust, Dino sang about respect, spiritual protection, and the intrinsic weight of womanhood. He told his brothers in the studio, "We've already made our millions by selling sex. Now we're going to prove that respect has a higher value." The industry's reaction was a study in clinical, corporate coldness. Relativity Records looked at the masterpiece Dino had created and didn't see a healing message. They saw a missed commercial opportunity. They wanted heat. They wanted another club anthem that would drive radio spins and nightclub revenue. The investigation reveals a pivotal moment of temptation. Label executives reportedly offered HTown an additional $2 million bonus if they would scrap the respect concept, remove the domestic violence hotline, and record a series of explicit, high-energy sex tracks to lead the album. Dino Conner looked at the $2 million on the table, money that could have secured his family's future for generations, and without a hint of hesitation, he said no. He refused to record what he called songs for profit, not purpose. It was an act of artistic and moral martyrdom. The fallout from the label was swift, surgical, and devastating. Because Dino wouldn't bend to the formula, the label decided to break the group's momentum. They pulled the entire promotion budget for Ladies Edition. They canceled the planned national tour. They made the album invisible to the gatekeepers of urban radio. The investigation shows that Ladies Edition, an album that many critics now consider one of the most mature and vocally superior R&B projects of the late 90s, was buried under a mountain of strategic corporate silence. The psychological stress of this blackout began to fracture the brotherhood. Shazam and G2Y were watching their success evaporate in real time, while Dino retreated further into his spirituality and his frustration with the industry's greed. The million-dollar checks began to dry up, and the threat of bankruptcy started to loom over the South Side mansion Dino had bought for his mother. Dino found himself trapped in a terrifying paradox. He had chosen his soul over the world, but the world was making him pay for that choice in the currency of his own survival. By the year 2000, the brothers had drifted into separate orbits. The arena shows had been replaced by small club gigs, the luxury hotels had become budget motels, and the dream that had started on that cracked Houston sidewalk was leading them back to the very streets they had once sang their way out of. But for Dino, the return to Houston wasn't a defeat, it was a homecoming. He became a ghost in the city, a man who walked through the neighborhood with a heavy heart but a clear conscience. He didn't know that his journey was nearing its final, silent intersection. He was only 28 years old, still writing songs with titles like The Day I Died, completely unaware that destiny was already driving a red SUV toward a midnight meeting on a Houston street corner, a meeting that would ensure his voice was never heard in this world again. By January 2003, Kevin Dino Conner was a man navigating the after. He was after the global fame, after the million-dollar checks, and after the brutal industry wars that had left him with a clear conscience but an empty pocket. He was back in the heat of Houston, the city that had provided the grit for his velvet voice. The investigation into his final days reveals a man who was restless, driven, and strangely prophetic. He was 28 years old, an age when most artists are just beginning to find their true creative footing. He had spent the previous weeks locked in a recording studio, working feverishly on a new HTown project titled Imitations of Life. His brothers, Shazam and G.E., would later recall that Dino seemed to be singing from a place of deep, premonitory clarity. One of the tracks he was most obsessed with was a haunting minor-key song titled The Day I Died. It was as if he was rehearsing for a finale he knew was coming. The night of the 28th of January, 2003, was ordinary until the exact moment it became eternal. Dino had just finished a late-night session, leaving the studio just after midnight. He was accompanied by his pregnant girlfriend, Teshia Ray Swawacki. They were in a blue sedan, navigating the grid of the city they called home. They were driving through the intersection of Airport Boulevard and South Glen. The investigation of the official accident report confirms a devastating fact. Dino wasn't the one at fault. He was driving within the limits, moving through the streets he knew by heart, when a red SUV ignored a traffic signal, hurtling into the intersection at a speed that made impact a mathematical certainty. The forensic reconstruction of the crash is a study in brutal, unforgiving physics. The SUV struck the passenger side of Dino's vehicle with such tremendous force that the sedan was propelled into a violent, uncontrolled spin that ended in a mangled heap of twisted steel and shattered glass. Dino and Tessia were killed almost instantly. In the world of music forensics, we often search for a deep, poetic meaning in an artist's death, but here there was only the cold, senseless geometry of a vehicular collision. The man who had survived predatory contracts, industry blackouts, and the systemic violence of poverty was taken out by a distracted driver on a quiet Tuesday night. The shockwaves that hit Houston were visceral and immediate. When Shazam and G.E. arrived at the scene, they didn't see a global superstar or the king of slow jams. They saw the broken body of the brother who had carried them on his back since they were kids in torn sneakers. The investigation into the aftermath reveals a city paralyzed by grief. This wasn't just the death of a singer, it was the death of a neighborhood's living proof that you could be honest and still be great. Dino was the one who had refused to sell out. He was the one who had come back to the South Side when the labels told him he was too deep. To the community, his death felt like the final, cruelest punchline to the struggle he had been singing about for a decade. But as we analyze the silence that followed the crash, we see the beginning of a legend that the industry could no longer suppress. The labels had tried to bury Ladies Edition while Dino was alive, but in the wake of his death, the fans began an archaeological dig. The songs about respect, spiritual healing, and domestic violence suddenly took on a hallowed, posthumous weight. The investigation shows that in the weeks following the accident, HTown's music saw a massive, organic surge in radio play across the southern United States. People weren't just knocking boots anymore. They were listening to the emotions of a man who had ultimately died with his soul intact. Dino Conner was physically gone, but the frequency of the South Side had just become permanent. He had finished his final vocal takes, and as we move into Part 6, we will investigate the emotional wreckage, the struggle of two brothers left to finish a masterpiece for a ghost, and the realization that Dino's voice was the only thing that could truly heal the family he left behind. In the wake of the 28th of January, 2003, the South Side of Houston entered a period of unnatural silence. But inside a small, dimly lit recording studio, a different kind of sound was beginning to emerge from the darkness. Shazam and G.E. were left with the most agonizing inheritance an artist can receive, a digital hard drive filled with scratch vocals, rough demos, and unfinished verses. The investigation into the year following Dino's death reveals a period of profound psychological imitation. The remaining members of HTown had to perform a task for which there is no roadmap. They had to figure out how to be a group when the lead singer, the man who served as their moral compass, their primary architect, and their conscience was no longer there to give the signal. The forensic challenge of this period was technical as much as it was emotional. Dino had left behind the skeletal vocal tracks for what he intended to be his greatest work, an album tentatively titled Imitations of Life. These were not polished, studio-ready recordings. They were the raw, unedited outtakes of a man working through his deepest thoughts in real time. Shazam and G.E. spent months sitting in the dark, wearing heavy studio headphones, listening to their brother's breathing between takes. The investigation reveals the sheer emotional toll of singing with a ghost. They had to meticulously match their live harmonies to the digital soul of a man who was already buried in a Houston cemetery. They were chasing a frequency that no longer existed in the physical world. The investigation into the 2004 release of Imitations of Life reveals a project that the mainstream music industry largely chose to ignore, but that the streets of the South immediately sanctified. The lead single, The Day I Died, felt less like a commercial R&B track and more like a forensic document. It was eerie, beautiful, and devastatingly prophetic. the brothers made a conscious, defiant choice. They refused to let a major label sanitize or overproduce the sound. They wanted the world to hear Dino exactly as he was, unfiltered, stubborn, and deeply spiritual. But without a massive corporate marketing machine behind them, the album struggled to find a foothold on the national charts. The industry had already moved on to the snap music and crunk era of the mid-2000s. Dino's velvet-wrapped soul was considered too heavy for a world that just wanted to dance and forget. However, the psychological investigation of Shazam and G.E. during this era shows that the success of the album wasn't measured in sales. For them, it was about the forensics of closure. They were no longer chasing platinum plaques or Soul Train awards. They were chasing the final threads of their brother's spirit. Shazam, in particular, struggled with the immense weight of stepping into Dino's lead role. The investigation reveals the trauma of a brother who has to lead a legacy while the world only wants to talk about the man who is gone. They became the perpetual keepers of the flame, touring small, smoky clubs across the South, singing Knockin Da Boots while looking at an empty microphone stand placed in the center of the stage. They were living in a permanent state of the after, trying to prove to the world and to themselves that HTown was more than just Dino, even though the silence in the studio told them otherwise. As we analyze the records from this period, we see a subtle but undeniable shift in the R&B landscape. The ladies' edition philosophy, the idea that black men could sing about respect and protection rather than just conquest, began to surface in the works of newer, younger artists. Dino had planted a seed of conscience that was beginning to grow in the shadows of the industry. The investigation shows that while the group HTown was fading from the Billboard Hot 100, the frequency of Dino Conner was becoming an embedded part of the genre's DNA. He was becoming the underground saint of Southern soul. By the late 2000s, Shazam and G.I. had finally settled into their role as the living monuments of the DeBarge and Jackson tradition of family harmony. They were no longer fighting the labels for promotion. They were fighting the inevitable fading of memory. They were ensuring that every time a speaker rattled with that heavy Houston bass, people remembered the man who refused to sell his soul for $2 million. As we move into the final chapter of this dossier, we will look at the eternal echo, how Dino Conner finally received the flowers the industry tried to withhold, and why, 20 years later, his voice is still the standard by which all Southern passion is measured. When Kevin Dino Conner was laid to rest in 2003, the music industry prepared to move on with its usual, cold efficiency. In the corporate offices of New York and Los Angeles, the HTown folder was being moved to the archives. To the executives, Dino was a tragic statistic, a difficult artist whose commercial peak was a decade in the past. But as this investigation concludes, we find that the industry's accounting was fundamentally flawed. You cannot measure the legacy of a man like Dino in units sold. You have to measure it in the forensics of influence. The investigation into the 20 years following Dino's death reveals a slow, steady, and organic canonization. While the snap and crunk music of the mid-2000s eventually burned itself out, the ladies' edition philosophy began to resurface in the most unexpected places. Modern R&B stars, from Drake to Bryson Tiller to Summer Walker, have all sampled or referenced the HTown sound. They aren't just chasing the melody, they are chasing that specific Southern vulnerability, the idea that a man can be rugged and respectful at the exact same time. Dino Conner didn't just record songs, he encoded a new DNA for the genre. In 2019, 16 years after that red SUV ended a life but started a legend, Dino finally received the flowers the industry had tried to bury. Under the bright lights of the National R&B Hall of Fame in Detroit, the name HTown was called. Shazam and G.I. stood on that stage, older now, their faces etched with the journey they had traveled without their leader. Behind them, a massive screen displayed a single, high-definition image of Dino, shirt open, microphone gripped tight, his eyes closed in a state of musical prayer. The investigation of that night shows a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. It wasn't an act of nostalgia, it was an act of forensic validation. The world was finally admitting that Dino was right. Purpose is more powerful than profit. The final verdict on the life of Kevin Dino Conner is a lesson in the price of purity. He came from a Houston sidewalk with nothing but a frequency, and he died with a clear conscience. He survived the predatory contracts of Miami and the corporate blackouts of Los Angeles. He was the man who looked at $2 million and chose to walk away because his message wasn't for sale. In the world of music forensics, we call this a zero-loss soul. He didn't leave anything on the table. He gave his pain, his lust, his respect, and finally his life to the music. As we turn off the lights on this dossier, the final image is not the mangled blue sedan on Airport Boulevard. It is a quiet night in a Houston bedroom where a young man is listening to emotions for the first time. He hears the rasp in Dino's voice, the raw honesty of a man who isn't afraid to be small. In that moment, the eternal echo completes its circuit. Dino is no longer a ghost, he is a teacher. He is proof that you can come from the South Side, you can be broken by the world, and you can still leave behind a sound that makes the world feel a little less lonely. The case of Dino Conner and HTown is officially closed, but the frequency is unbroken. Every time that beat drops in the heart of Houston, Dino still sings.